Hello everybody, we are back to teach you the next term CIP, the twin brother of CPT, which we described during the previous slide. But before anything, the disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer and lessons given are not legal advice. I'm just sharing my professional knowledge and experiences earned over 2 decades. The codes we use from the Incoterms 2020 book are all the intellectual property of ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, whom I thank for their effort and perseverance in updating and revising the terms and also permitting us to use the codes. CIP, as I told you, is the twin brother of CPT, and the difference is the insurance, which in CIP is under seller. As you can see in this diagram, which shows a combined shipment, which of course we talked about this during the previous slides. The difference between this slide and the same slide in CPT is the insurance line. And as you can see, the insurance line is in 2 colors. The first part, which is in blue, is until the delivery point, which is on the seller's cost, and actually it covers seller's risks. But after the delivery point, the insurance, which continues until the CPT point, covers the buyer's risks. Also, the cost is paid by the buyer in the invoice to cover the risks until the CPT point. When we say CPT point, we mean until where the seller has committed to pay the transportation. And when we say delivery point, we mean the point that the risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer. Yes, and here is the second slide in which we have used the air shipment for our transaction. And again, you see the insurance lines with the same structure as we saw in the previous slide. Carriage and insurance paid to CIP. The carriage insurance paid to CIP in Incoterms 2020 rule is similar to CPT with one very important difference. This rule requires the seller to take out maximum insurance cover under Institute Cargo Clause A or Air or similar for the buyer's risk. The seller must give the buyer any insurance document the buyer will need in case it must claim under that insurance. As you can see, one of the biggest differences between CPT, CIP, and CIF is that in CIF, for example, the seller was supposed to buy the minimum insurance cover, unless it was agreed between the buyer and the seller to buy a higher cover of insurance. A1. General obligations. In each of the 11 rules, the seller must provide the goods and their commercial invoices as required by the contract of sale and any other evidence of conformity, such as an analysis certificate or weighbridge document, etc., that might be relevant and specified in the contract. Each of the rules also provides that any document can be in paper or electronic form as agreed in the contract, or if the contract makes no mention of this, then as is customary. The rules do not define what electronic form is. It can be anything from a PDF file to blockchain or some format yet to be developed in the future. B1. General obligations. In each of the rules, the buyer must pay the price for the goods as stated in the contract of sale. The rules do not refer to when the payment is to be made: before shipment, immediately after shipment, 30 days after shipment, half now and half later, or whatever, or how it is to be paid: prepayment against any mail of copy documents, on presentation of documents to a bank under a letter of credit, or other arrangements. These matters should be specified in the contract. A2. Delivery. The seller delivers the goods by handing them over to its contracted carrier on the agreed date or within the agreed period. There has in the past been some confusion because Incoterms 2000 referred to the first carrier if there were subsequent carriers. In practice, there may be several carriers contracted in turn by the seller's contracted carrier, such as the truck collecting the goods and taking them to the airport terminal, the cargo handler contracted by the airline to move the goods to the aircraft and load them onto it, the airline itself, and the repeat of these at the other end. but the only carrier of concern is that carrier contracted to move the goods from the point of delivery to the destination. Most importantly, the delivery occurs when the seller passes the goods to their carrier to transport them, not when the goods reach the destination. B2 delivery. The buyer not only must take delivery when they have been handed to the seller's carrier, but also physically receive them at the named place or point within that place of destination. A3 transfer of risk. In all the rules, the seller bears all risks of loss or damage to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2 described above. The exception is loss or damage in circumstances described in B3 below, which varies dependent on the buyer's role in B2. B3 transfer of risk. The buyer bears all risks of loss or damage to the goods once the seller has delivered them as described in A2. If the contract provides for the buyer to inform the seller the time for dispatching the goods or the point of receiving the goods within the destination place, and the buyer fails to do so, then the buyer bears the risk of loss or damage to the goods from the agreed date or the end of the agreed period. For example, if the buyer does not inform the seller where he is to send the goods, how can the seller dispatch them? If the seller has clearly identified the goods, then the risk transfers to the buyer either on the agreed date or the end of the agreed period. A4 carriage. The seller must contract for the carriage of the goods or procure such contract if this is one leg of a string sale. The contract must be from the place of delivery and may be an agreed point within that place. It must be made on usual terms and for the usual route in a customary manner of the type used by the carriage of the type of goods sold. If the seller and buyer agree on specific matters regarding the contract of carriage, that is well and good, but if they don't, then the seller must arrange it in the usual manner for those goods. As the seller has to arrange the carriage, it needs to know from the buyer if there is a specific point in the place of destination to which the goods must be transported. For example, if the destination is shown as simply New Delhi, India, where in that large metropolis is the seller's carrier to leave the goods? It could be that it is to be the buyer's premises, or a particular location, say in a greenfields building site, or the carrier's premises, or the airport, or the container yard. The exact point should be agreed upon. If it is not, then it is the seller's choice to select the point that best suits its purpose, usually being the cheapest option, such as a cargo terminal. If the delivery at the destination is to occur after the buyer completes any necessary import formalities, then the cost of storage due to delays in those formalities being completed is for the buyer, always assuming the seller has provided the buyer with necessary document in time. The seller must comply with any transport-related security requirements for the whole of the transport to the destination. B4 carriage. The buyer has no obligation to the seller to arrange a contract of carriage. A5 insurance. The seller must arrange a contract of insurance at its own cost to cover the buyer's risk. This cover must be of the level provided by LMA IUA Institute Cargo Clauses A or similar, dependent on the mode of transport used, often referred to generally as all risks, as it covers all manner of risks with specific exclusions. If the buyer requests, the seller must also arrange at the buyer's cost additional cover under the LMA IUA Institute War Clauses, Cargo, and Institute Strikes Clauses, or similar, dependent on the mode of transport, unless such cover is already included, as it usually is with the all-risk insurance. The amount of the insurance must be at least 110% of the invoice value and in the currency of that invoice and contract. It must cover the goods for at least the duration from the point of delivery described in A2 above to the named place of destination. Often in contracts of sale and letters of credit, the stipulation is the unnecessary wording warehouse to warehouse. As you see here, it has said that it is unnecessary to write warehouse to warehouse. But according to my experience, in many cases it's better to write warehouse to warehouse, because in many cases when the delivery is done at the destination, which might be a customs house in the country of destination, and when the goods are released from the customs, during the transport from the customs house until the warehouse of the customer, if something happens, the insurance will not cover that. So be careful to write warehouse to warehouse. The seller must provide the buyer a separate contract or a certificate under an existing policy giving the details of the shipment to enable the buyer or anyone else having an insurable interest in the goods. Having an insurable or anyone else having an insurable interest in the goods to claim from the insurer. This document usually shows the seller as the insured and is then endorsed by the seller on the back of the original or originals in blank or with a specific endorsement. The seller must also provide the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk and expense with information that buyer needs to arrange any additional insurance. B5 insurance. Despite the buyer having the risk of loss or damage to the goods from the delivery point, the buyer does not have an obligation to the seller to insure the goods. However, the buyer must provide the seller, if it requests, with any information it needs to arrange any additional insurance requested by the buyer under A5. For example, the seller might need to know the location of the destination warehouse so its insurer can assess the risk and levy an appropriate premium. A6 delivery transport document. The seller must provide the buyer with the usual transport documents for the transport contracted in A4 if it is customary or the buyer requested it, and at the seller's cost. As CPT and CIP cover any mode or modes of transport, what form that document of transport takes will be dependent on the mode or modes used. If the modes include carriage by sea, as in FCL or LCL transactions, then it is usual for the seller to obtain a seaway bill or bill of lading. If the latter is issued in a negotiable form and in several originals, then a full set of those originals must be presented to the buyer, sometimes through the seller's bank to the buyer's bank under a letter of credit. If the modes include the goods going by air, then typically an airway bill will be issued, and if requested, the seller will be given one original for shipper. But this is not a negotiable transport document. Shipment by truck might involve issue of a CMR in Europe or simply some form of consignment note or truckway bill, and these two are not negotiable. Shipment by rail similarly will usually be covered by some form of rail consignment note that is not negotiable. The transport document must cover movement of the contracted goods within the agreed period for shipment. If it is agreed, then this document must enable the buyer to claim the goods from the carrier at the named place of destination, and in a string sale enable the buyer to sell the goods in transit to a subsequent buyer by transferring that document. This would usually be in the form of a negotiable bill of lading. B6 delivery transport document. The buyer must accept the transport document provided by the seller so long as it is in conformity with the contract. A7 export-import clearance. This rule, like all the multimodal rules, is suitable for both domestic and international transactions. Where applicable, the seller must at its own risk and expense carry out all export clearance formalities required by the country of export, such as licenses or permits, security clearance for export, pre-shipment inspection, and any other authorizations or approvals. The seller has no obligation to arrange any transit or import clearances. However, if the buyer requests at its own risk and cost, the seller must assist in obtaining any documents and or information which relate to formalities required by the country of transit or import, such as permits or licenses, security clearances for transit or import, pre-shipment inspection required by the transit or import authorities, and any other official authorizations or approvals. B7 export-import clearance. Where applicable, the buyer must assist the seller at the seller's request, risk and cost in obtaining any documents and or information needed for all export-related formalities required by the country of export. Where applicable, the buyer must carry out and pay for all formalities required by any country of transit and the country of import. These include licenses and permits required for transit, import licenses, and permits required for import, import clearance, security clearance for transit and import, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorizations and approvals. They are the buyer's responsibility because they occur after delivery by the seller. At first glance, it might seem strange that both seller and buyer have responsibility for pre-shipment inspections. To clarify, the seller is responsible if it is a requirement of the country of export, and the buyer is responsible if it is a requirement of the country of transit or import. A9. Allocation of costs. The seller must pay all costs until the goods have been delivered under A2. Other than any costs, the buyer must pay as stated in B9. Transport costs resulting from the contract of carriage, including costs of loading the goods and any transport-related security, must be paid by the seller. The cost of providing the buyer proof of the goods being delivered are also for the seller. If the contract of carriage includes unloading at the agreed destination, the seller must pay these. Additionally, any costs of transit included in the contract of carriage must also be paid by the seller. The seller must pay any costs involved in providing the usual proof that the goods have been delivered. So if the contract between the parties states that proof as being a transport document, then the carrier's document fee is on the seller. The seller must pay any costs, export duties, and taxes, where applicable, related to export clearance. The seller must pay the costs of insurance. If the buyer is requested by the seller to provide information or documents in relation to export clearance or insurance, then the seller must pay the buyer for these costs. B9. Allocation of costs. The buyer must pay the seller all costs relating to the goods from when they have been delivered, other than those payable by the seller. If the seller has been requested by the buyer to provide assistance in obtaining information or documents needed for the buyer to effect import formalities, then the buyer must reimburse the seller's costs. Where applicable, the buyer must pay any duties, taxes, and other costs for import clearance. The buyer must pay for unloading costs unless they were paid by the seller under the contract of carriage. The buyer pays for any costs of the country of transit unless they have been paid by the seller under the contract of carriage. A10. Notices. The C clauses, the C rules, as we have seen before, involve two distinct points. This is reflected by the requirement that the seller must give the buyer notice that the goods have been delivered as required in A2, and any notice the buyer will need enabling the buyer to receive the goods. The manner in which this will be done is usually detailed in the contract, such as by a simple email and/or copies of shipping documents being emailed. B10. Notices. If the parties agree in the contract that the buyer is entitled to determine the time for the seller to deliver the goods, and possibly more importantly, the point within the named place of destination where it will receive the goods, the buyer must give the seller sufficient notice. The contract will usually detail how much notice is to be given, and this might vary with the mode or modes of transport. Points to keep in mind. Before continuing with this part, I should tell you that many points which were said in CPT were avoided to be repeated in CIP because we didn't want to repeat the information again and again, and as we told you before, CIP and CPT are twin brothers and there are many similarities between them. The differences are mentioned here and we discuss about them. Number 1. In CIP, the insurance is on the seller and the insurance policy is a must-be as a shipping document. There must be no non-conformity between what has been agreed and what has actually happened. Also, the buyer must make sure the insurance coverage is sufficient. 2. In CIP 2020, the seller is committed to buy the insurance clause A for the shipped merchandise. But again, there are some coverages excluding in clause A. So if the buyer requires, it can ask the seller to increase the cover, but the added cost will be on the buyer. 3. The term is a good choice for a letter of credit.